Hello and welcome to episode 8, the final episode of Wight Wanderers Disused Railway Lines of the Isle of Wight. I'm Jack.
And I'm Eleanor.
And it is a grey, drizzly day in October. We are currently sat on the platform at Merston waiting for the train to Ventnor West. It hasn't turned up so far though, has it?
Maybe it's cancelled.
It might be, I'll check. We missed the last train.
When was it?
1952. Never mind, we're going to have to walk it. Do you want to say the line?
Let's crack on.
The last railway of the series is perhaps the most interesting, in that it really shouldn't have existed. Finished in 1897, 35 years after the construction of the Cowes to Newport Railway, the Ventnor West Railway branched off the Sandown to Newport line, heading south through the historical settlement of God's Hill before reaching the pretty village of Whitwell. A 619-yard tunnel was then bored out, emerging on the cliff face above the terminus at St Lawrence. It took a further 3 years for the railway to reach its final destination at Ventnor West, then called Ventnor Town. Ironically, this station was even further from the town than the original Ventnor station opened by the Isle of Wight Railway in 1866. Merston, situated a few miles southeast of Newport, is a small village built into the flatlands south of St George's Down. It's hard to imagine nowadays that this was once an interchange for two separate railways. The line to Ventnor West branched off east of the crossing, following the prominent tree line towards God's Hill.
Now, because this line closed so early, we're going to have pretty much the same issue as we did with the freshwater branch, which is a lot of the alignment has been reclaimed by farmland. So what we're going to do is try and crisscross it as much as possible and see as much as we can. There are still a lot of relics left on this line, including a railway tunnel, so it's well worth it.
It certainly wasn't worth it though for the company that built the line. By the late 1800s, the Isle of Wight Newport Junction Railway, who run the Sandown to Newport line, were already financially crippled and had been incorporated into the Isle of Wight Central Railway. The operation of a new line branching off the railway, which was already bankrupt and passing through the proverbial end of nowhere to a town that already had a station, proved to be even more of a burden. Amazingly, even though it closed before any of the other railways on the island, all of the station buildings still exist, including the one at God's Hill, a simple one-platform halt, awkwardly situated half a kilometre west of the village centre.
And that really does highlight the issue with this railway. Now, the reason that a lot of station buildings on the island don't survive, like Cowes, Newport and, say, Freshwater, is because towns and villages have expanded and evolved over them. Yet on this line, the station buildings still survive, and that's because modern development still hasn't reached them yet. So you can imagine how barren and remote they must have been back in the 50s when this line shut. And the fact they built it decades after the other lines on the island, they had time to sit back and observe the financial woes of other rural railway lines, and yet they still built it. They still thought it was a good idea. The railway though did have one redeeming feature: its unmatching beauty.
From here to Whitwell, the countryside is rich and relatively untouched. The railway would have been a superb vantage point, gradually rising on a single track embankment, cutting straight across the evergreen. In this density, we can also find evidence of other industrial activity, including this water-powered mill, which has sat abandoned in the woods since the early 1900s. This is Bridgecourt Corn Mill, which appeared on the maps in 1759, though it is said an earlier mill once stood in its place. Back to the railway though, and heading south, parts of the embankment appear to have been removed, possibly for farming purposes. But at Beacon Alley, the remains of a large overbridge is still a strong indicator to where the railway once ran.
So basically, a lot of the railway line between here and Whitwell is unwalkable. We have to crisscross over it via other footpaths, which is annoying because a lot of it is still very prominent on the landscape. It rises high above the surrounding fields on a big embankment, but it's all private land. So we had two choices. We could either walk up Deacon's Lane, something like that, and go the long way round, which is quite busy and quite narrow, or we could take the footpath through the woods, which we knew would be quite muddy. We did want to go to the pub at the end of this walk to celebrate the end of the series, but in the state we're in, I don't think they're going to let us in.
After a bit more trudging, we arrive at the little hamlet of Roud. There was no station constructed here, but further down the road, the embankment is still quite noticeable amongst the tree line. Not letting the weather dampen our spirits or spoil the view, we find possibly the most prominent section of the railway embankment, sandwiched between Miller's Lane and Whitwell Road.
So here at Miller's Lane is a prime example of what I was talking about. You have the bridge abutment on the south side and the embankment going towards Whitwell. But if you pan over this way, you can actually see the whole of the land has been flattened. There's no embankment anymore, and it's all been reclaimed by farmland.
One thing that has become apparent so far is how much engineering work was put into this line. Counting 7 overbridges so far, or possibly more, on a railway which was logically flawed. Approaching Whitwell, we admire the charming buildings and of course pay a visit to the local library. The station here was possibly the grandest of all the stations on the line, and featured 2 platforms, a goods yard and a crossing loop. This loop later became defunct in 1926 as traffic dwindled, and in 1941, despite the grandeur of the station itself, it was downgraded to an unstaffed hold. Luckily, most of the station remains, including the buildings, canopies, platforms and a few more throwbacks to its railway past.
It wouldn't be one of our videos without it spontaneously bucketing it down halfway through. So sorry about the camera work, I'm holding the umbrella. South of Whitwell, the railway which once dominated the landscape now starts to become part of the landscape around it, and soon the landscape around it will swallow it up completely as we get to the tunnel. That's if we get there, because it's quite windy. So as you could probably tell by the last clip, the weather was pretty horrendous. Our umbrella broke and we had to retreat to Whitwell. So we've had to come back today and continue our journey, the final part of this line. We're going to pick up where we left off, south of Whitwell, and try and find the north portal of St Lawrence Railway Tunnel, or High Hat Railway Tunnel as it's also known.
We rejoin the railway at Whitwell Road crossing, where the gatekeeper's cottage is still in place. From here, it's a 300-metre walk into the overgrown cutting to the north portal of the tunnel. What do you think now?
Spooky.
Spooky. We just checked out St Lawrence Railway Tunnel, which was very cool and very spooky, wasn't it?
Very spooky.
Nell was a lot more braver than I was, but yes, it was fantastic. It was nice to see. So we're now walking up St Radigan's path. I think it's called St Radigan's, something like that, and it pretty much follows the alignment of the railway through the tunnel to the south portal. So when we get to the other side of the hill, we have to walk down some very steep steps to try and find the south portal of the tunnel before we get to St Lawrence station.
As we reach the top of the down, the sun comes out, and we are treated to wonderful views over Woody Bay. The dramatic coastline here is infamous for its history of smuggling and shipwrecks. No less dramatic was the path of the railway emerging from the cliff face high above the town and treading along a narrow ridge blasted into the side of the hill. Down the steps and under the overhang, we find the south portal of the tunnel. Looking inside, we can see the sharp curve at the end of the bore, explaining why we couldn't see daylight from the other end. As the train left the tunnel and into the light, the passengers must have gasped at the grand views over this spectacular coastline. Along Seven Sisters Road, a vast retaining wall was needed to support the railway above, as it descended into St Lawrence Station.
We're at St Lawrence Railway Station. It's still here, it's still in good nick. This was the original terminus for the line when it was built in 1897. It wasn't until 1900, 3 years later, the line actually extended into Ventnor at a station called Ventnor Town. It was later renamed Ventnor West.
The station at St Lawrence sits on a plateau under the cliff, but above the town. The limit of space here meant the station could only be served by a single line, squashed between the platform and the imposing rock face. The rather narrow railway bridge still remains in place, and the line towards Ventnor West is still traceable, now housing some pretty swanky holiday homes. North of Inglewood Park, the remains of one last overbridge can be found deep under the overcliff. Some rather slippery steps then allow us to conveniently walk the last stretch of the railway alignment.
This is it, the last couple of 100 metres of railway line on the Isle of Wight left to walk. The weather's held off so far. It's just about to rain again. We're walking down towards the last station on the list, number 40 of 40, which is Ventnor West.
Before we get there though, let's take a wide look at the railways which once reached to all four corners of this little island. Most built out of ambition, but plagued with financial hardship. They changed the landscape, in some places rather dramatically. They allowed us to travel from coast to coast in mere hours instead of days. They brought civilization to ancient villages, food and goods to our doors. But they died out as impatience and convenience took over. Today though, that convenience has worn thin, and with new trains being hailed as the quicker and eco-friendlier option, how convenient would it be now if these lost lines had somehow survived? For the Ventnor West Branch though, it was a railway doomed to fail from the start. Built on a whim, maybe out of desperation or just because they could. But for all its grand construction, the line lasted only a smidge over 50 years. And in 1952, the most picturesque railway on the Isle of Wight closed for good.
So that's it, that's the final station, number 40 of 40 on the list. We'd like to say a massive thank you to everyone who has liked the videos and subscribed to the channel. We never thought we'd get this many likes and views. We were just doing it for a laugh. And yes, it became a bit of a thing, so thank you so much. Just because this series is over though, doesn't mean that the channel is over. Nell is going to be starting her new series next week. So that's it for now. Please do like and subscribe, and thank you very much once again. We are off to the pub.